Welcome to your online lecture for the Gospel according to Mark, part of chapter 12 in your textbook. We begin with the Gospel according to Mark because if we accept the theory of the development of the Synoptic Gospels, then Mark was written first. And we begin our study of the four Gospels by looking at Mark in order to see how Mark is developed by other writers. With respect to authorship, there's a long tradition that can be traced to approximately 150 CE that attributes authorship of this gospel to someone called John Mark, a companion of the Apostle Paul and perhaps of Peter. There are other traditions that have developed and tried to explain who the author is, but at the end, the safest conclusion is that the author of the gospel is anonymous. You can find more on this in page 456 in your textbook. With respect to when the Gospel was written, according to the tradition, Mark was written after the death of Peter and Paul in Rome, about 63 CE. The Gospel also seems to indicate the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, and that being either imminent or had just taken place. So a dating just before or after 70 CE appears most likely. With respect to who the Gospel of Mark was written to, the tradition is that Mark originates in Rome. This is credible because it seems to have a general audience in mind. Also, since the Gospel is written in Greek, the audience was presumably Greek-speaking. The audience was more likely Gentile than Jewish, since the Gospel assumes readers are not familiar with Hebrew and Aramaic words and Jewish practices. We turn now to the literary world of the Gospel according to Mark. For Howard Young, they take the theme, the secret revealed through suffering, and consider the gospel through that light. Mark, while being the shortest of the gospels, is not the easiest to understand. This is because it is difficult to see how Mark interpreted his sources, since we do not have his sources. This is also because Jesus is portrayed as a puzzling, mysterious presence surrounded by confusion and misunderstanding. Some biblical scholars term this the messianic secret. And we see this literary device used by Mark from the beginning of the gospel right till the end. Jesus telling his disciples who do recognize who he is to downplay that he is the Messiah. It climaxes with a full recognition of Jesus as the Messiah, not by a Jew, but by a Gentile. A careful reading of the first chapter of Mark reveals several of the crucial themes recurrent throughout. First, Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Next, power and authority and continuity from the prophet Isaiah to Jesus. And finally, Jesus prepares the way for the kingdom of God, a new age in which God's rule will be fully manifest, is imminent, a reign which has dominion over evil. After the arrest and imprisonment of John the Baptist, Jesus sets about his work. It soon becomes clear that in Mark, Jesus proclaims the gospel not so much by what he says as by what he does. He begins to gather disciples who leave their secular lives to follow him. According to Mark, when the call goes out, immediately they leave their nets. It's interesting to note the word immediately in Greek is used 8 times in chapter 1 and 40 times in the entire gospel. Some biblical scholars attribute this to sloppy writing, while others see this as adding to the theme of immediacy found throughout the gospel. The second section of the Gospel contains vignettes exemplifying the mysterious power of Jesus. He astonishes the people at the synagogue at Capernaum, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. As well, he displays the power to cast out evil spirits and to heal the sick. However, he does not stay in one place long enough to establish a reputation, and he instructs exorcised demons and healed people to keep quiet about him. When word spreads, he flees. Again and again, the question is raised, why? As his ministry continues, the Galilean people respond enthusiastically to him, while the hostility of the scribes, Pharisees, and members of Herod's entourage intensifies. This juxtaposition, as well as rising tension, demonstrates the care that the writer has in writing the gospel. In section 3, a number of key developments take place. Jesus withdraws to the Galilee, as he is opposed by Herod and his regime, and he is followed by the multitudes. Second, Jesus selects 12, a symbolic new Israel, and sends them out to proclaim the kingdom of God with acts of power. Third, Jesus returns to Nazareth, where he is rejected by the townspeople and even by his own family. Fourth, returning to the Sea of Galilee, Jesus tells parables of the kingdom to the gathered crowds, parables stressing the fact that from meager and sometimes obscure beginnings, the kingdom will grow and ultimately flourish. Only those on the inside are taught directly, with everything explained to them. Next, miracles continue, as does the admonition of Jesus to keep silent about them. And finally, the 12 are sent out again, return, and with the feeding of the 5,000, begin to show their lack of understanding. Because of hardness of heart, not even the inner circle to whom Jesus was explaining everything grasps the truth. The section climaxes with a rebuke by Jesus to the 12. Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And now the impending suffering and death of Jesus become the dominant focus. Finally, in Caesarea Philippi, one of the 12 has his eyes opened, after the story of a healing of a blind man with physical blindness. In response to the question of Jesus, "Who do you say I am?" Peter gives the answer the readers of the gospel know to be true. You are the Messiah. But again, Jesus counsels secrecy. With this glimmer of understanding, Jesus then reveals to the 12 that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. But they do not understand. Peter, who has sensed the truth that Jesus is the Christ, rebukes Jesus for speaking of suffering, drawing from him the stinging rebuke, "Get behind me, Satan." It is interesting to note that the identification of Jesus as the Son of Man has generated intense debate among interpreters. Some argue that the phrase is a title for the apocalyptic figure who will come at the end of the age to inaugurate the kingdom of God. If so, then the claim that the one sent to inaugurate it must suffer is remarkable. Of course, it may simply be a euphemism for I or me, but the emphasis is on the necessity of suffering. 3 times this passion prediction is repeated by Jesus. His teaching, healing, and the acclamation of him as Christ is not sufficient. He must undergo suffering. Moreover, if those who follow him are truly his disciples, they too will suffer. This is the great irony of Jesus' kingship. Many biblical scholars have called this gospel a passion narrative with an extended introduction, not only because the story of the final week in Jerusalem occupies 1/3 of it, but also because with the passion, the secret is revealed. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem is a public pronouncement of the messianic nature of Jesus' ministry. He fulfills a prophecy for the entry of the Messiah into Jerusalem, but it is an entry of humility, not belligerent power. He cleanses the temple, but then refuses to discuss with the chief priests, scribes, and elders the nature of the authority by which he has acted. He makes no effort to use the incident as a catalyst for an open confrontation with the power of these religious leaders or the power of Rome. Only when he has been taken captive and his fate has been sealed does he accept the title of Christ. To the end, his closest disciples seem baffled. They desert him when the times come to suffer and are absent when the empty tomb reveals the vindication of that suffering. At what is usually assumed to be the original ending of Mark's Gospel, in chapter 16, verse 8, the women who come to the tomb are overcome with awe and keep to themselves what they have seen and heard. On the cross, a suffering Jesus cries out all alone, my God, why have you forsaken me?" quoting Psalm 22, a lament. When apocalyptic signs herald the new age at his death, it is not the disciples, but a Roman centurion who makes a confession of faith. Truly, this man was God's Son. In summary, as we look back over Mark's Gospel, a pattern emerges behind the shadows. It begins with John the Baptizer. He proclaimed the message of a new age and, as a result, suffered. Jesus, too, announcing the kingdom of God with his words and deeds, but only at his suffering does the kingdom begin to break into history. In the apocalyptic section of Mark, chapter 13, we find the prediction that those who follow Jesus will likewise suffer, with a promise that the one who endures to the end will be saved. Like their master, their suffering will lead ultimately to the glory of the kingdom.